When I was younger, I thought that divorce was a terrible thing. I had learned that it displeased God and personally witnessed some of its negative effects. Everything that I knew about divorce led me to think that it was always bad and wrong. I had no other views on the subject until my eyes were opened to my family's entire situation. Being in the situation myself helped me gain perspective and think outside of the obvious implications of divorce, and now I realize that divorce can be for the best sometimes. My whole struggle with the subject started when I was 4 and my uncle's wife divorced him. Being that young, I obviously had no clue what was wrong between them. However, I knew everything that happened to my cousins. When their parents split, everyone moved out of the house, and my cousins began to live two very unstable and confusing lives. They told me that they hated going back and forth in between houses, and that both places were totally different. Shortly after, their parents began dating new people that neither of them liked. Their lives had changed so dramatically in such a short amount of time. It was terrifying to watch happen. Then later in elementary school, I made several friends whose parents were divorced. When I was at their houses, I felt sort of uncomfortable, especially if we were at one of their dads. The homes felt incomplete like that. I remember always comparing this to my family's dynamic and noticing that my friends' families seemed to lack order and discipline with only one parent in charge. And I also got to see a little bit of what it was like to have two separate homes. For those of my friends whose parents were not on good terms, the two houses would be totally different, and it seemed like the parents were competing for their child's favor, just adding to the chaos and confusion by having different or no rules. So these experiences had already left a bad taste in my mouth, but on top of that, I began to develop a religious problem with divorce. When I suddenly became so exposed to it, my parents made sure I understood that it was very serious and wrong, and beyond that, I knew from what I heard in church and Sunday school that it was not okay. And the final reinforcement came from Bible classes and even random discussions that I had at the Christian school I attended from 6th grade through graduation. At school, I also learned that there were sometimes exceptions in the matter of divorce, and that it was not always bad, but with all of my past experiences, I was unable to understand what they were saying. However, I desperately wanted to understand because my family was not in very good shape. I knew from a rather young age that my parents fought sometimes, but I never knew what it was about. And even though it worried me, I eventually dismissed the fears that stemmed from their arguments. But as time went on, their problem progressed. It went from having occasional misunderstandings to them sometimes arguing in front of us to them fighting regularly. When I first noticed the progression, I thought that it was just because they were growing more and more tired of each other. I was wrong, though. Eventually, after asking some questions and really paying attention to what the arguments were about, I realized that they had just been more careful around us when we were younger. What I found is that my dad is an alcoholic. Things had been pretty bad for a long time, but the situation wasn't something young children can handle, so they tried to hide it from us. Once everything was out in the open, though, things started changing. It was suddenly obvious how abusive my father was and how unhappy we all were. The openness also caused my father to be harsher with me and my sisters. He had always been sort of angry and impatient, but he got worse. He was emotionally abusive, always putting us down. He started telling me I wasn't talented and should give up on music, or sometimes he would just tell me that I was a piece of shit like my mother. Other times he would be more physical, depending on how openly drunk he was, and would push us around and throw things and charge at us and slam his fist against the wall where he had one of us cornered. He became a monster. Stupidly, I begged my mom not to divorce him anyway. Eventually, my dad filed for divorce, though. For a while, I begged them not to follow through because I was still concerned about things changing, and more importantly, them breaking their promise to God. But then, one morning, when my dad was gone, my mom and sisters and I began talking about how much happier we were when he wasn't around, and then it all just clicked for me. I understood what my school had been trying to teach me. The healthiest thing would be for my dad to be removed from our lives. After this revelation, I consulted the scriptures and my Bible teacher and came to the conclusion that, of course, there were exceptions to divorce, and our situation was one of them. My mom would not be breaking her promise. She would be saving us from an abusive, miserable situation by signing the papers. I was incredibly pleased with this new knowledge because I knew that, rather than sinning against God, we were saved by His love and mercy. He had provided us with an escape and delivered us from our mess. So then I spoke with my mom and sisters, and it turned out that we had all basically come to the same conclusions. Of course, this conversation involved some tears. There were some for the pain of everything that had happened, and then others for the healing and happiness. And even though that one heart-to-heart didn't fix everything, it set our healing in motion. My parents divorced last year, and our home could not be more peaceful. With my dad being gone, we were able to finish healing together, so everything has turned out pretty well. I still don't think of divorce as a good thing in general, but what I have found is that it can be a justified means to escape an abusive situation. So even though I don't think that divorce is always right, I now realize that sometimes it can be healthy.